Hello everyone, welcome to another Wine and Weird Tales extravaganza. So, based off the recent Twitter poll, Death Has Red Hair beat Spider Mansion. Actually, no, it didn't. It was like 50-50. So I'm going to read both. I'm going to read both, but I'm going to start with Death Has Red Hair because, you know, it's like the first sequential story. Okay, so we're going to start with Death Has Red Hair by Gray Laspina from the September 1942 edition of Weird Tales magazine. Let's begin. Death Has Red Hair by Gray Laspina. We three men were hugging the open fire closely. The raw chill of that November night had closed in around us, and the blazing logs yielded grateful warmth. Peter Murray was leaning forward in his chair, looking absent-mindedly into the leaping flames that sent flickering shadows to dancing on the walls behind us. Hank Walters was staring at Peter, and I was watching both my guests with curious speculation that had risen in me since that afternoon's encounter. I could have sworn that Hank's black eyes held an expression at once envious and inimical as he bent his gaze dourly on Peter's handsome, perplexed young face. I was both dismayed and sorry, for the older man possessed a weapon that might cut the brightness out of Peter's life. Magda's Farrar was his forest daughter and his ward, and to young Peter she symbolized and embodied everything desirable in life. Are you talking about a weapon or a girl? Let's find out. "Come out of it, you two," I growled. Growled I, irritated and uneasy at their silence. "This is a shooting party, not a wake." Peter's bright blue eyes turned from the fire. He met my gaze and chuckled. Hank's lowering face followed the younger man's movement, then suddenly shifted uneasily. He must have noticed that I was observing his guarded expression, for his mouth compressed tightly for a moment before he spoke. "Hell of a party," said Hank distinctly. "When a man can't chalk a pretty girl under..." What? "When a man can't chuck a pretty girl under the chin without having a fool youngster butt into his fun." What? It was out now. I regarded him with hidden dismay. The underlying currents of hidden emotion had forced their way to the surface and could no longer be tactically ignored. I was furious at Hank for his lack of restraint. More than that, I had been, still was, just as disgusted at his behavior that afternoon as had been Peter. Being older than either of my two guests, I had possibly learned to be diplomatic, sufficiently so at least, not to have thrust myself unnecessarily into the situation. Where my tactful absence would have been better appreciated than my presence. I had seen nothing, after all, but Peter's restraining hand on Hank's restive shoulder, and the disapproving swirl of a girl's abbreviated... There was abbreviated skirt and long cloak into a part of the woods where the low undergrowth was not yet entirely denuded of foliage. All I had heard had been Hank's exclamation, coming almost directly upon the girl's scream. Peter must have been quick in his reaction. "Take your hand off me, you damned young cub!" had shouted Hank, with uncontrolled passion for which I did not at the moment entirely blame him for. No man relishes the admonishing admonishing restraint of a youngster in front of a woman, particularly, no matter how much he may have deserved it. Jesus fucking Christ. What the fuck was going on? Knowing Hank's proclivities, I could reconstruct the scene fairly well. He must have come upon the girl before she realised his proximity, and mischievously pulled off her pointed cap with tassel that hung to her shoulders, confidently relying upon his vaunted masculine charm to smooth over the situation if it should unexpectedly tend toward the unpleasant. The girl had sprung to her feet, snatched for her cap, which Hank had thrust tormentingly behind him. Whereupon she had let out that electric scream, and the scream brought knight-errant Peter tearing out of the woods behind them to remonstrate with Hank, who had naturally resented the interference. The girl had taken advantage of Hank's momentary guardedness to snatch vainly for her pointed cap that had fled incontinently without it. Yeah, I often flee incontinently. With dismayed astonishment, I had heard her scream, for it was not a scream of surprise, it was a cry of pure anger, of such depth and intensity that it startled shivers running up and down my backbone. It was almost unhuman in its expression of thwarted fury, arousing in me a powerful curiosity to see this girl who was so capable of such a strength of emotion. At the same time, I felt a dread of seeing her, as if she might prove to be more than my old eyes would care to take in. Let's hope so. Peter told me as we walked some distance behind Hank on our way back to my little shooting lodge. Hank strode ahead of us with a thunderous black countenance, a pointed, tasselled stockingette cap dangling from one hand. That the girl was, well, Judge, extraordinary, if you get what I mean. Can't say that I do, Peter. Can't say that I do, Peter. Now, if you were telling me that Magda Farrar was extraordinary, I suggested, that Peter shook his blonde head impatiently. Magda, he explained carefully but unconvincingly. Now, this girl was, well, say, Judge, do you remember that Hans Christian Andersen story about the Earl King's daughter, who were beautiful before, but hollow seen from behind? That girl's scream didn't ring hollow, Peter, I bantered. His blue gaze was earnest fire. Judge Holly, she made me remember those elf princesses. There was a something, he tried to tell me lamely, about her eyes, and her whole expression, elfish, unearthly. That wasn't. I can see that this wood nymph has made a strong impression on you, my boy. Condescending. As for a hollow back, Peter, her long cloak completely enveloped her, Judge. As for my impression, what I got wasn't pleasant. You see, she was absolutely white with fury at Walter's, and she let out that scream. Cool. Peter actually shuddered at the mere remembrance of it. I felt sick. I confess it struck me that way too, Peter, I conceded. Very strong personality, that young woman's, I mused thoughtfully. Walters had no business to snatch off a strange girl's cap, Peter criticized as he swung along beside me. Walters has a weakness toward all femininity, Peter, I muttered depreciatorily. Who could know my own law partner as well as I? He means no harm, just his little failing, my boy. Like a fucking creep. Sex pest. You could just say it, Judge, he's a sex pest. Just his failing, repeated Peter. It was his little failing that tortured and killed Magda's mother. What? What? Oh, wait, what? I could not deny that. Everybody knew that Hank's peccadillos on the primrose path had disillusioned and, yes, had broken Edith Farrar Walter's heart. She had literally died of a broken heart induced by the crash of her house of dreams. Her own physician had told me, but that is another story. Yeah, but not an interesting one. I have to finish up in a minute. Still, you had no business interfering, Peter, I said gravely. Hank is an older man than you. Also, he is Magda's guardian. Who the fuck is Magda? That last touched Peter, who stared as if this thought, with its attendant interference, came to him for the first time. After a moment's silence, he declared stubbornly, just the same, he had no right to pull off that girl's cap and keep it from her. A perfect stranger. Judge, I have a feeling that she won't let the matter drop. She'll get back at him. Petty vengeance. Oh. Stiff legs. Poppycock, I laughed. Then I suppose that's her cap he's swinging at us like red flag at a bull, quoth I, amused. Oh, well, it was the 40s. Peter nodded. Judge, that girl had the most marvellous red hair I've ever seen in all my life. It almost getting annoyed. It almost wasn't real. Why, it was like a mass of curling flames that tumbled, blazing upon her shoulders when Walters pulled her pointed cap off. And do you know, it struck me that what made her furious was because he'd uncovered her wonderful hair, and she couldn't tuck it out of sight again. Perhaps she was mortified at wearing it long when everybody else has shingled theirs. I suggested too, smartly perhaps, for Peter bestowed upon me a long look of acute scorn. There was something absolutely extraordinary about the girl's hair, he repeated inanely. You've said that before, Peter, I reminded him dryly. Extraordinary, you know, not quite normal. Peter seemed to be analysing his sensations, as if it were all alive in every strand. Why, when he pulled off her cap, it was like uncovering the darting flames of a glowing torch. Very poetic, Peter. I wonder how Magda would relish such absorbed interest in this strange young woman's Titan locks. Magda's human, retorted Peter strangely. Now this girl. And he began going over it again, as if he couldn't let the subject rest. And in that fashion we had tramped along behind Hank, who strode blackly ahead of us, actually, in his preoccupation, slamming the lodge door shut in our faces when he entered. Rude. Fucking rude. And now, after a couple of hours stewing and simmering of their emotions, Hank, the older man, who should have been the one to control himself, burst out incontinently. Everyone was incontinent back in the 40s, I've noticed. Like, most people. Just trying to picture bursting out incontinently. Hell of a fine party, he said again, and shot Peter such a look. That look made me feel a bit sickish with apprehension, for I knew Hank capable of meanness, and when he'd lost control of himself. It was only his unusual intuitions along legal lines that had constrained me to continue in partnership with him after Edith's sad death, Edith, whom Peter and I both loved. Sorry, Walters, Peter began to apologize. manfully. But the girl, to hell with the girl, snarled Hank. Tensing his, says crouch, but I read crotch. Tensing his crouched figure with the suggestiveness of a huge wild beast about to make its spring. That Peter saw this movement and I've got to stop reading. That Peter saw this movement and interpreted it clearly, I realized when the boy got to his feet with a little guarded movement and stood in a position of vantage, looking down upon us both as we sat before the smouldering logs on the rude stone hearth. Yeah, the stone hearth is rude. I said I was sorry, repeated the boy with gravity. I was taken off my guard by the girl's scream. I rather thought you'd no business thinking anything about her, growled Hank, and his nostrils dilated, then pinched whitely. All right, there we go. That's part 1 of Death Has Red Hair. So far, I'm intrigued. This is good. This is really good. I'm going to wrap up. What do you think? What do you think? Love to know, as always. I'm going to wrap up now because I don't want to run over time too much. My phone doesn't handle storage well. I hope you've enjoyed this first reading of Death Has Red Hair. Sorry for my many, hiccups along the way. What do you call it? Anyway, no, let's not get into that. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to the next installment. I hope you do too. See you soon.